Deep inside the Library of Congress sits a filing cabinet holding the voices of Americans long gone. Not audio recordings, but transcripts. Thousands of pages of handwritten and typed interviews carried out between 1936 and 1940 by government-employed writers dispatched to homes across 24 states with one simple mission: capture their stories before those stories disappeared forever. The program was known as the Federal Writers Project, a branch of Roosevelt's New Deal that put unemployed journalists, novelists, and researchers to work documenting the everyday lives of ordinary Americans. They gathered 2,900 life histories in total. Then those histories were boxed up and shipped to the Library of Congress, where they sat largely untouched for nearly 4 decades. I stumbled upon them while searching for something completely different. I was following architectural records from the 1870s, trying to understand why so many American courthouses and government buildings from that era were built to proportions that seem out of place for the people who supposedly used them. The same question I keep circling back to. But the further I dug into those archives, the more I realized the buildings weren't the real story. The people were, because those 2,900 interviews preserved something no textbook ever could: the first-hand memories of Americans who were alive before everything changed. And what they described doesn't line up with the history we've been handed. Let me explain what I mean by before everything changed. Do the math. An American born in 1855 who lived to 85, not at all unusual, would have died in 1940. That means they were still alive, still talking, still remembering when those government writers came knocking. They would have been children during the 1860s and 1870s. They would have lived through the most dramatic shift in American history, not stretched across centuries, but compressed into a single lifetime. And their grandchildren, born in the 1920s and 1930s, heard those stories directly. Those grandchildren are the last generation carrying the oral history of the old world. And they're nearly all gone now. Mary Kelly was born in 1851 in Southfield, Michigan. She lived to 113 and died in 1964, alive before the Civil War, and still here long enough to see television in every American home. Maggie Barnes was born to a formerly enslaved woman in the early 1880s and lived to approximately 115, passing away in 1998 in North Carolina. These weren't rare exceptions. The Gerontology Research Group has verified 16 supercentenarians born in the 1850s alone. Dozens more lived past 100. Hundreds lived past 90. An entire generation of witnesses whose memories bridged 2 completely different worlds. The government had the opportunity to document all of them. It documented 2,900. Then it stopped. The project lost its funding in 1939, handed off to state control after congressional hearings, and was effectively shut down. The interviews were packed into boxes and never published in any accessible form until the 1970s. 30 years of silence around the last first-hand testimony of Americans who remembered what came before. Before what, exactly? That's where October 8, 1871, becomes impossible to look away from. Every American learns about the Great Chicago Fire, Mrs. O'Leary's cow, the wooden city, the rebuilding. What almost no one learns is what happened that same night, at that same hour, across 3 states at once. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a firestorm swallowed the entire town in roughly 1 hour. Between 2,000 and 2,500 people died, making it the deadliest wildfire in recorded American history. The fire scorched 1.2 million acres. Survivors described winds powerful enough to lift grown adults off their feet, flames that moved faster than any person could outrun, and heat so overwhelming that people crossing open ground simply caught fire without ever touching a visible flame. Reverend Peter Pernin, the parish priest who survived by submerging himself in the Peshtigo River, published his eyewitness account in 1874. He described something that doesn't behave like any ordinary wildfire. The oxygen was consumed so rapidly that people with no visible burns were found dead, as though the air itself had been turned into a weapon. The fire generated its own weather system, a vortex of superheated wind that behaved less like a forest fire and more like something detonating outward from a central point. That same night, Holland, Michigan burned. Manistee, Michigan burned. Port Huron, Michigan was threatened. Across 2.5 million acres of the upper Midwest, fires ignited simultaneously. The National Weather Service confirms these fires broke out across 3 separate states on the same evening. The official explanation points to drought, lumber debris, and a cold front with strong winds. Reasonable enough, except for one detail that has nagged researchers since 1883, the simultaneity. In 1883, a hypothesis emerged, suggesting that fragments of Biela's comet had struck the atmosphere and ignited the fires from above. That theory resurfaced in a 1997 documentary and was investigated again in 2004 by the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. Witnesses in Chicago reported blue flames burning in basements, a color consistent with unusual chemical combustion, not burning wood. The theory has never been proven. It has also never been disproven. But here's what matters most for this investigation. The elderly Americans interviewed by WPA writers in the 1930s were children in 1871. A 70-year-old interviewed in 1938 would have been just 3 years old that night. An 80-year-old would have been 13, old enough to have watched the sky turn red, old enough to have been told by their parents exactly what happened. The Library of Congress describes those 2,900 interviews as containing tales of surviving the 1871 Chicago fire and stories of pioneer journeys. But that barely scratches the surface. What else did those Americans remember? What did they tell the government writers about the night everything burned? And why was the project shut down before the full picture could come together? The burning wasn't the only erasure. In 1890, the United States carried out the most thorough census in its history. For the first time, every family received a full individual form. The census recorded immigration status, naturalization details, English language proficiency, home ownership, and Civil War service. 62.9 million Americans documented in extraordinary detail. It was also the first census in which the government broke from a century of protocol and chose not to require copies to be filed in local offices. Every previous census from 1790 to 1880 had local backups stored in county courthouses and state archives. The 1890 census existed in one place only, the basement of the Commerce Department building in Washington, D.C. On January 10, 1921, a fire broke out in that basement. Roughly 25% of the records were destroyed outright. Another 50% suffered serious water and smoke damage. No definitive cause was ever established. Theories ranged from a discarded cigarette to faulty wiring to spontaneous combustion of sawdust in the building's workshop. What followed the fire is more unsettling than the fire itself. The surviving records, perhaps half still usable, were transferred to a warehouse. For 12 years, nothing was done. No restoration effort, no attempt to copy or preserve what remained. Then, in December 1932, the chief clerk of the Bureau of the Census sent the Librarian of Congress a list of documents scheduled for destruction. The 1890 census was on that list. The librarian was asked to identify any records worth preserving for historical purposes. He identified none. Congress authorized the destruction on February 21, 1933. The very next day, February 22nd, President Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, the fireproof facility created specifically to prevent exactly this kind of loss. They destroyed the records one day before breaking ground on the building that would have saved them. Of 62.9 million names, roughly 6,160 survive. The single most comprehensive record of every American alive during the transition period. The people who remembered the old world, wiped out. Not in one dramatic moment, but through sequence. Fire, neglect, bureaucratic process, authorized destruction, each step plausible on its own. Together they form something much harder to dismiss. And then there were the children. Between 1854 and 1929, approximately 250,000 children were loaded onto trains in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, and transported to rural communities across the Midwest and West. The Orphan Train movement, organized primarily by the Children's Aid Society, founded in 1853 by Charles Loring Brace, and later by the New York Foundling Hospital. At stops along the route, the children were put on display in what contemporary accounts describe as auction-like events. Farming families looked them over, evaluated their size and apparent health, and selected the ones they wanted. Many were taken to work fields. Fewer than half were actual orphans. The rest were children of immigrants, children of the poor, children whose parents couldn't afford to feed them, or couldn't fight the institutions that took them. An estimated 30,000 children were living on the streets of New York City in the 1850s alone. But here's the part nobody talks about. Upon arriving in their new communities, older children were strongly encouraged, sometimes outright required, to cut all ties with their past. Names were changed. Origins went unrecorded or were recorded inaccurately. The organizations running the program kept careless records at best. Many of these children could not tell their own grandchildren where they came from, because they genuinely had no idea. 250,000 Americans whose identities were functionally erased. An entire generation severed from their own history by institutional design. The timing is exact. The Orphan Trains ran from 1854 to 1929. The fires came in 1871. The photographs of giants clustered between 1850 and 1900. Tartaria disappeared from maps in the mid-1800s. The architectural shift from grand classical to simplified modern happened within the same window. And the 1890 census, the one record that would have documented every single person alive during this transition, was eliminated. Not coincidence. Pattern. Which brings us to 1893, and the buildings they don't want you to examine too closely. The world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. 27 million visitors over 6 months. More than 200 buildings spread across 630 acres of Jackson Park, the White City. Official history tells us these massive neoclassical structures, enormous domes rivaling European cathedrals, columns and sculptural detail as precise as ancient Rome, were built in under 2 years using a mixture of plaster, cement, and jute fiber, wooden frames, horse-drawn equipment, hand tools, manual labor. No cranes, no bulldozers, no modern construction technology. 200 buildings, 630 acres, under 24 months. And then, after just 6 months on display, nearly every single structure was demolished. The only major building to survive was the Palace of Fine Arts, preserved because it had been made fireproof to protect the art inside. Everything else was torn down or burned. This pattern repeated itself. Paris, 1889. Buffalo, 1901. St. Louis, 1904. San Francisco, 1915. Build magnificent structures of impossible scale and detail. Put them on display briefly. Destroy them completely. Every single time. The elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s remembered the White City. Some had visited as children or young adults. They walked through those buildings and encountered something that looked nothing like the America being constructed around them. Something older, something grander, something that felt less like a temporary exhibition and more like a city that had always existed. And then it was gone. Here's what I keep returning to. There was a woman. There had to have been, in every county in America in the early 1950s. A woman born in the late 1850s, living past 90, sitting in her home, surrounded by grandchildren who'd grown up on her stories. Stories about buildings that were already ancient when she was a girl, even though the textbooks insisted they had been built just years before. Stories about the night the sky turned red across 3 states. Stories about trains carrying children westward with no names, no families, no pasts. Stories about a world that operated by entirely different rules than anything her grandchildren saw around them. Different proportions, different architecture, different knowledge. And when she tried to share those memories, when she described what she had witnessed with her own eyes, they nodded politely and changed the subject, because her memories didn't match the textbooks. And in 1950s America, the textbooks always won. The WPA captured some of those voices, 2,900 documents from 24 states. But what about the other 24 states? What about the thousands of elderly Americans who were never interviewed? What about the stories passed across kitchen tables, on front porches, and on deathbeds in the 1940s and 1950s that no government writer ever recorded? Those stories were handed down to grandchildren who are now in their 80s and 90s, the last human chain connecting us to first-hand memory of whatever existed before the transition. And that chain is almost broken. The timeline isn't subtle. The 1850s through the 1870s, old world architecture standing everywhere, oversized doorways, impossible construction, buildings scaled for someone other than us. The fires of 1871, simultaneously destroying cities across 3 states in a single night. The 1890 census capturing 62.9 million names during the transition, then stored without backup for the first time in American history. The 1890s, photographs of giants stop surfacing. Reports of skeletal discoveries disappear from the record. Maps are quietly redrawn. The White City is built, displayed, and demolished. The Orphan Trains finish relocating 250,000 children with severed identities. The 1921 fire damages the census. The 1933 order destroys what's left. The 1936 WPA project races to interview the last witnesses and is defunded 3 years later. By the 1950s, the last Americans who saw the old world with their own eyes were gone, and their grandchildren chose silence because the alternative was too enormous to face. The Library of Congress still holds those 2,900 documents, transcribed testimonies from Americans who lived through whatever this was. They've been publicly available since the 1970s. They're searchable, they're readable. And I have to wonder, has anyone truly gone through every single one? Has anyone combed through them looking for the details that don't fit, for the memories that contradict the official record, for the specific descriptions of buildings, fires, proportions, and technologies that the textbooks insist never existed? Because the last Americans who remembered are gone. Their grandchildren are almost gone. But the words are still in the archive. And archives don't forget, not even when everyone else agrees to. The buildings remember, even when we don't. The documents preserve what the encyclopedias erased. And somewhere inside those 2,900 transcriptions, in the careful handwriting of Depression-era government workers recording the memories of Americans born before the transition, the truth is sitting in a filing cabinet, waiting. The same way it has been waiting for nearly a century, for someone willing to read what the last witnesses actually said, instead of what we've been told they should have remembered.